The people who hide the biggest secrets are rarely the ones running away. They're the ones quietly waiting for someone they love to stop asking the wrong questions. Damien Blackwood had built an empire by trusting patterns instead of promises. Every meeting started on time. Every shipment followed a schedule. Every rival eventually revealed a weakness. That discipline had never failed him until it came to Ethan Carter. Ethan smiled the same gentle smile every morning, poured coffee into the same white mug, remembered exactly how Damien preferred his breakfast, and somehow still carried a quiet distance that no amount of affection could erase. It wasn't coldness. It wasn't fear. It was something softer, heavier, like someone carrying a memory too fragile to share. Damien noticed the change 3 Fridays ago. At exactly 4 o'clock every afternoon, Ethan would leave their penthouse alone, decline the driver waiting downstairs, and disappear into the city before sunset. He always returned after dark with tired eyes and a smile that looked carefully practiced. When Damien asked if everything was all right, Ethan would simply nod and say he had visited an old friend. Nothing about the answer sounded dishonest, yet nothing about it felt complete. Damien could have ordered an investigation with a single phone call. His security team could trace every street, every payment, every camera within minutes. Instead, he did something none of his closest associates would have believed. He followed Ethan himself. The next Friday, Damien left 10 minutes after Ethan stepped outside. He traded his tailored jacket for a plain charcoal coat, parked several blocks away, and watched from a distance as Ethan walked instead of calling a car. The route surprised him. Ethan ignored the polished skyline and expensive neighborhoods, choosing older streets where brick buildings carried faded signs and family-owned stores had survived decades of change. Children laughed outside a corner bakery. Wind chimes moved gently on a front porch. The neighborhood felt untouched by the world Damien controlled. Ethan stopped to buy a small paper bag filled with fresh pastries before continuing on foot. Along the way he greeted an elderly florist by name, waved to a mechanic closing his garage, and smiled at a little girl struggling to hold the leash of an energetic golden retriever. Every face recognized him. Every greeting was genuine. Damien stood across the street, realizing there was an entire chapter of Ethan's life he had never seen. His heartbeat slowed, not from relief, but from uncertainty. Who had Ethan been before their paths crossed? Why had he never mentioned this place? Ethan finally turned toward a narrow street lined with aging maple trees whose branches stretched across the road like quiet guardians. At the end of the block stood a modest brick building with colorful flower boxes beneath every window. There was no sign outside, only a small wooden bench near the entrance and bicycles resting against the fence. Ethan paused for a moment before opening the gate. His expression changed completely. The careful smile Damien knew became something warmer, effortless, almost weightless. For the first time in weeks, Ethan looked truly happy. Damien remained hidden beneath the shade of an old oak tree across the street, unable to look away as the front door opened from inside and someone rushed toward Ethan with unmistakable excitement. Ethan stepped through the gate, and within seconds a small child ran across the courtyard with open arms. Damien instinctively leaned forward from his place beneath the oak tree, careful to remain hidden behind the thick trunk. The little boy could not have been older than 6. He laughed with the kind of carefree joy that could brighten an entire neighborhood, and Ethan immediately knelt to meet him at eye level before wrapping him in a warm embrace. The child held tightly to Ethan's shoulders as though they had been separated for weeks instead of days. Damien could not hear every word from across the street, but he saw Ethan hand over the paper bag of pastries, earning an even bigger smile from the boy. Moments later, several more children rushed outside, surrounding Ethan with excited voices and endless questions. One little girl proudly held up a drawing covered in bright colors. Another tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve, eager to show him something inside the building. Ethan laughed softly, his expression completely transformed. There was no trace of the quiet sadness Damien had watched grow over the past several weeks. Here, Ethan moved naturally, greeting every child by name, remembering birthdays, asking about school projects, and listening with genuine patience to stories that probably seemed ordinary to everyone except the people telling them. Damien had never seen this version of him. The powerful executives who negotiated with Damien always measured every word. The influential families in the city constantly calculated their next advantage. Even close friends usually wanted something in return. Yet nothing about this place felt transactional. Ethan gave his attention freely, and the people around him responded with effortless trust. After several minutes, an elderly woman opened the front door and welcomed everyone inside. Ethan carried 2 boxes from a nearby shelf before following the children into the building. Curious, Damien crossed the street after making certain no one was watching. He stopped beside the wooden fence where a polished brass plaque had been mounted years earlier. The engraving had faded with time but remained readable. Maple House Community Family Center. Founded to support children and families in need. Damien stared at the words longer than he expected. He had reviewed thousands of financial reports throughout his career, donated anonymously to charities recommended by advisors, and signed checks large enough to renovate entire facilities without ever visiting them. Yet Ethan had never mentioned this place. Why keep something so meaningful hidden? A delivery van pulled into the small parking lot, and a volunteer stepped out carrying boxes of books. Damien quietly moved farther back into the shade while watching through the windows. Inside, Ethan helped arrange chairs into a circle before sitting beside the children as they opened storybooks together. Every few minutes another volunteer approached him with a question, and Ethan always answered with calm confidence. It was obvious he had been coming here for a long time. This was not an occasional visit. It was part of his life. Damien checked his watch. Nearly 2 hours passed without him noticing. As evening settled over the neighborhood, families gradually arrived to pick up their children. One by one, the rooms emptied until only Ethan, the elderly director, and the little boy remained. The director smiled kindly before saying something that Damien could barely make out through the partially open window. The boy looked up at Ethan with hopeful eyes and suddenly reached for his hand. Then, with complete innocence, the child spoke 2 simple words that drifted across the quiet courtyard on the evening breeze. "Daddy, wait!" Damien felt the world around him fall completely silent as his heartbeat echoed louder than anything else he could hear. Damien remained frozen beneath the old oak tree long after the child disappeared back inside the building. The 2 words echoed in his mind with impossible clarity. "Daddy, wait!" They were spoken with complete innocence, without hesitation, as though they had been repeated countless times before. Damien searched for another explanation, but every possibility seemed less convincing than the last. He had spent years reading people, predicting motives, and recognizing deception before anyone else could. Yet nothing about Ethan's reaction had looked rehearsed. There had been no surprise, no awkward correction, only a gentle smile as Ethan squeezed the boy's hand and answered with the same quiet warmth he used whenever he comforted someone. Damien finally turned away and walked back toward his car, but he did not start the engine. Instead, he sat behind the steering wheel while the city lights slowly reflected across the windshield. His phone buzzed twice with messages from his executive assistant asking for approval on several business decisions. He ignored every notification. For the first time in years, numbers, contracts, and meetings felt meaningless compared to a question he could not answer. Why had Ethan hidden this entire part of his life? The drive home passed in silence. When Ethan returned nearly an hour later, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. He carried an empty paper bag, smiled as he entered the kitchen, and apologized for being later than expected because the children had wanted to finish reading one last story together. Damien watched him carefully from across the room. Ethan's eyes looked tired, but peaceful. There was no sign of fear, guilt, or anxiety. If he truly carried such a significant secret, he hid it with remarkable grace. Damien almost asked about Maple House. The words reached the edge of his lips before disappearing. Something stopped him. If Ethan wanted to tell him, he would have done so already. That realization hurt more than Damien expected. Later that evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep with a novel resting against his chest, Damien stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. His trusted security director, Marcus Hayes, answered on the second ring. Marcus immediately noticed the unusual hour. Damien rarely called unless something required immediate attention. Marcus offered to begin a complete background investigation before Damien even explained the situation. The proposal was efficient, legal, and entirely consistent with how their organization handled uncertainty. Damien stared out across the city before quietly refusing. No surveillance teams. No financial records. No private investigators. No electronic tracking. Marcus remained silent for several seconds, surprised by an answer he had never expected from the man known for eliminating uncertainty before it became dangerous. Damien ended the call with only one instruction. If anyone else asked questions about Ethan, Marcus was to tell no one anything. The secret would remain between them. The following Friday arrived more slowly than Damien cared to admit. Once again, Ethan left the penthouse at exactly 4 o'clock, carrying another small paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. Damien followed from a greater distance this time, determined not to interfere. At Maple House he watched Ethan spend the afternoon repairing shelves in the reading room, organizing donated books, helping children with homework, and laughing at jokes that only they seemed to understand. Every passing minute complicated the picture instead of clarifying it. Nothing suggested dishonesty. Nothing suggested manipulation. Yet the mystery only deepened. As evening approached, the same little boy ran toward Ethan again, this time proudly holding a framed drawing. Ethan accepted it with visible emotion before kneeling to thank him. The child wrapped both arms around Ethan's neck and smiled so brightly that even Damien felt the warmth from across the courtyard. Then the elderly director stepped outside carrying a folder thick with papers. She handed it to Ethan with a reassuring smile and said something too soft for Damien to hear. Ethan's expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared. His shoulders became tense. He looked down at the folder as though it contained news he had feared for a very long time, and without realizing it, Damien took one cautious step closer, convinced that whatever was inside those pages would finally begin to reveal the truth. Damien waited until Ethan left Maple House before quietly crossing the street. The evening air carried the scent of fresh rain and blooming flowers as volunteers locked the front entrance one room at a time. He had no intention of stepping inside, yet his attention remained fixed on the thick folder Ethan had carefully slipped into a canvas bag before leaving. Whatever those papers contained had changed Ethan's expression in an instant. It had not been fear alone. It had looked like the quiet exhaustion of someone preparing to carry another impossible burden. Damien returned to his car with more questions than answers. During the following week, he found himself noticing details he had ignored for months. Ethan spent late evenings reading through paperwork at the dining table after believing Damien had gone to sleep. Every few nights he quietly made another phone call from the balcony, speaking so softly that only scattered words reached the living room. Appointment. Approval. Next month. Everything will be ready. The conversations never lasted longer than a few minutes, and every time Ethan walked back inside, he wore the same calm smile that hid whatever weighed on his heart. Damien considered asking directly more than once. He imagined sitting across from Ethan, with 2 cups of coffee and simply saying, "Tell me what you are carrying." Yet every opportunity slipped away. If Ethan truly wanted to share the truth, why had he chosen silence instead? That question lingered longer than any answer Damien could invent. By the next Friday, curiosity had become quiet obsession. Damien once again followed Ethan to Maple House, remaining far enough away to avoid being seen. This visit felt different from the previous ones. Ethan spent less time with the children and more time inside a small office near the back of the building where volunteers carried folders, envelopes, and several sealed boxes. Through the partially opened blinds, Damien caught brief glimpses of Ethan reviewing documents with the elderly director. Every page seemed important. Occasionally Ethan nodded before carefully signing a form, only to pause and stare at another page for several long seconds. His shoulders grew heavier with each signature. Hours later, the meeting finally ended. The director gently placed a comforting hand over Ethan's before offering a reassuring smile. Ethan responded with gratitude, but his eyes shimmered with emotion he quickly forced back behind another composed expression. As he stepped outside carrying the folder again, the little boy from the previous visit ran toward him with a handmade card decorated in bright blue stars. Ethan accepted it as though it were the most valuable gift in the world. The child laughed and hugged him tightly before racing back toward the playground. Damien watched the scene unfold from behind a parked delivery truck, trying to understand why every answer seemed to create an even greater mystery. Ethan looked nothing like someone living a double life. He looked like someone protecting one. The afternoon sunlight slowly faded as Ethan walked away from Maple House instead of heading home. He stopped at a quiet park overlooking a small lake where families fed ducks along the shoreline. Choosing an empty bench beneath a tall maple tree, he opened the folder once more. Damien remained hidden several yards away. He could not read the pages, but he saw Ethan remove a folded photograph from inside. Ethan traced the edge of the picture with trembling fingers before lowering his head. A single tear landed on the photograph. He quickly wiped it away, looked toward the evening sky, and whispered something too faint for Damien to hear. A few moments later, he carefully returned the photograph to the folder and closed it as though sealing away an entire chapter of his life. Just as Ethan stood to leave, his phone rang. He answered immediately, listened without speaking, and then quietly replied, "I understand. I will not tell Damien until everything is certain." Damien felt every thought inside his mind come to a sudden stop as those words settled into the silence, leaving him with only one impossible question. What truth was everyone protecting him from? Damien remained where he was long after Ethan walked away from the park, unable to convince himself that he had heard those words correctly. Ethan had never lied outright, yet he had clearly chosen to keep something hidden. The thought settled heavily in Damien's chest. Every quiet smile, every late evening phone call, every unexplained Friday suddenly felt connected by an invisible thread that he could almost see but could never quite grasp. He returned home before Ethan, hoping to compose himself, but the silence inside the penthouse only amplified the questions circling his mind. When the front door finally opened, Ethan stepped inside carrying the familiar canvas bag and offered the same gentle smile that had always put Damien at ease. This time it did not. Damien watched carefully as Ethan prepared dinner, humming softly while setting 2 plates on the table. Nothing about his behavior suggested deception. If anything, Ethan seemed unusually attentive, asking Damien about his day, refilling his glass before it was empty, and smiling whenever their eyes met. Damien answered every question calmly, yet each reply felt heavier than the last because he now knew there were conversations happening beyond the walls of their home that deliberately excluded him. Later that night, Ethan fell asleep on the sofa after reading through another stack of documents. The folder from Maple House rested beside him, secured with a simple blue ribbon. Damien stood only a few feet away. One small movement would allow him to untie the ribbon and discover everything Ethan had worked so hard to hide. His hand slowly reached toward the folder before stopping in midair. He had built his reputation by uncovering secrets, but this one belonged to the person he loved most. If he crossed that line, there might be no way back. After several long seconds, Damien quietly picked up the folded blanket instead and gently covered Ethan's shoulders before carrying the untouched folder into the bedroom and placing it exactly where Ethan had left it. The following morning, Ethan thanked him for the blanket with a grateful smile that made Damien feel even more conflicted. Throughout the week, Damien noticed another change. Ethan began checking his phone more frequently, sometimes stepping onto the balcony after receiving a message and remaining there for several minutes before returning inside with red eyes that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. Twice Damien caught him quietly wiping away tears before forcing another reassuring smile. Ethan always insisted he was simply tired. Damien wanted desperately to believe him. By Thursday evening, the emotional distance between them had become impossible to ignore. They still shared meals, exchanged warm conversations, and laughed over familiar memories, yet something invisible now stood between them. Damien could sense Ethan carrying an enormous weight alone, while Ethan seemed equally determined to keep Damien safely outside whatever storm was approaching. Neither of them knew how to bridge the silence growing between them. Friday arrived once again. This time Damien did not follow immediately. Instead, he waited nearly 30 minutes before driving toward Maple House, telling himself that perhaps he needed to prove to his own heart that he was imagining connections that did not exist. As he approached the neighborhood, he saw Ethan leaving the community center much earlier than usual. The canvas folder was no longer in his hands. Instead, he carried only the handmade card covered with blue stars. Ethan walked several blocks before stopping outside a small family medical clinic tucked between a pharmacy and a neighborhood grocery store. He took a deep breath before entering alone. Damien remained across the street, watching through the large front windows. A receptionist greeted Ethan warmly and handed him another envelope. Moments later, a doctor joined him in the waiting area. The doctor spoke gently while pointing to several pages inside the envelope. Ethan listened without interrupting. Then, despite trying to remain composed, he lowered his head and quietly began to cry. The doctor offered a box of tissues and rested a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan nodded several times before carefully placing the envelope inside his bag and whispering, "Please, just give me a little more time before he knows." Damien did not follow Ethan into the clinic. Instead, he remained across the street, watching the reflection of passing cars blur against the large glass windows. From that distance he could only see fragments of the conversation. The doctor spoke calmly. Ethan listened in silence. Then Ethan nodded several times before carefully accepting the envelope with both hands, as though it contained something too important to risk dropping. When he finally stepped outside, his eyes were still slightly red, but by the time he reached the sidewalk, he had already rebuilt the gentle smile Damien knew so well. It amazed Damien how quickly Ethan could hide his pain. The smile looked real enough to fool almost anyone. It no longer fooled Damien. He waited until Ethan disappeared around the corner before driving home alone. The entire trip passed without music or conversation. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. Every memory replayed itself from a different angle. Ethan laughing with the children. Ethan protecting the folder. Ethan whispering that Damien could not know yet. None of it sounded like betrayal when viewed separately. Yet together the pieces formed a story Damien could not understand. He had promised himself he would respect Ethan's privacy, but uncertainty was becoming its own quiet prison. That evening Ethan returned carrying fresh groceries and greeted Damien with the same warmth as always. They prepared dinner together, sharing small conversations about ordinary things. Ethan joked about burning the garlic bread. Damien smiled politely. For anyone watching, nothing appeared unusual. Only the silence hidden beneath every sentence revealed how much had changed. After dinner Ethan excused himself to answer another phone call on the balcony. Damien remained inside, staring through the partially opened sliding door. He never intended to listen, but the cool evening breeze carried several words across the room before either of them realized it. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know the deadline is close. I understand, if the approval does not come in time, then I will do it anyway. No, Damien cannot be involved. He has already sacrificed enough because of me." Damien stood perfectly still. He had only heard part of the conversation. The person on the other end continued speaking too softly to understand. Ethan listened without interrupting before quietly replying, "If there has to be one person who carries the consequences, it should be me." The call ended moments later. Ethan remained on the balcony for several minutes, looking out across the city skyline while blinking away fresh tears before finally returning inside with another carefully composed smile. Damien pretended to be reading a business report. Ethan noticed nothing unusual and simply wished him good night before disappearing into the bedroom. Sleep never came. Damien lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of Ethan's breathing beside him while countless possibilities fought for space inside his mind. Was Ethan facing a financial crisis? Had someone threatened Maple House? Was the little boy connected to whatever decision Ethan believed he had to make alone? Every answer created two more questions. By sunrise, Damien had convinced himself of only one thing. Ethan believed he was protecting him from something significant. Whether that protection was necessary remained impossible to know. The following afternoon, Damien cancelled 3 executive meetings for the first time in years. Instead of attending another boardroom discussion, he quietly drove back toward the neighborhood surrounding Maple House. He parked several blocks away and walked the familiar streets without any clear destination. Children played basketball in a nearby park. A mail carrier greeted residents by name. Everything felt peaceful, almost untouched by the complicated world Damien inhabited. As he passed a small coffee shop, 2 elderly women sitting outside recognized Ethan's photograph on the handmade card still visible inside Damien's memory. One of them smiled warmly and said, "That young man comes here every week. I have never met anyone who gives so much of himself without asking for anything in return." Damien slowed his steps but kept walking, unaware that only a few blocks away, someone else had been quietly watching him, and that the stranger had already reached for a phone to report that Damien Blackwood had begun searching for answers on his own. The stranger never approached Damien directly. Instead, he remained inside the coffee shop, speaking quietly into his phone before disappearing through the back entrance. Damien noticed nothing. His attention stayed fixed on Maple House and the questions that had quietly taken over every corner of his life. As he turned toward the community center once again, an elderly gentleman slowly stepped out onto the front porch carrying a cardboard box filled with donated books. His silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and although age had bent his posture slightly, his eyes remained remarkably sharp. When one of the boxes slipped from his hands, Damien instinctively walked forward to help gather the books scattered across the sidewalk. "Thank you," the elderly man said with a warm smile. "My knees are not what they used to be." Damien returned the last book to the box and nodded politely. Before he could leave, the gentleman looked at him for a long moment, as though recognizing something beyond his face. "You know Ethan, do not you?" Damien hesitated before answering honestly. "Yes. We live together." The man's expression softened with unmistakable relief. "Then I have wanted to thank you for a very long time." Damien frowned slightly. "Thank me." The gentleman smiled. "My name is Walter Brooks. I have volunteered here for almost 15 years. Maple House would not still be standing without Ethan." Damien remained silent, allowing the older man to continue. Walter looked toward the building where children's laughter drifted through an open window. When funding almost disappeared several years ago, Ethan quietly began organizing donations. He never wanted anyone to know where the money came from because he believed gratitude should belong to the children, not to the people helping them. Every holiday he arrived before sunrise to decorate the building himself. Every birthday was remembered. Every frightened child found someone willing to sit beside them until they smiled again. Damien listened carefully. None of this matched the growing fears that had haunted him for weeks. Walter continued arranging books before speaking again. "You have probably met Noah." Damien immediately remembered the little boy who had called Ethan Daddy. Walter laughed gently at Damien's expression. "Everyone misunderstands that at first. Noah started calling Ethan Daddy after losing both of his parents in an accident several years ago. Ethan corrected him every single time in the beginning, but eventually one of our counselors explained that children sometimes use familiar words for the people who make them feel safe. Ethan never tried to replace anyone. He simply refused to let Noah feel alone." Damien felt the air leave his lungs. Every assumption he had carefully constructed began quietly collapsing. Walter noticed the surprise in Damien's eyes and gave a sympathetic smile. "You did not know that, did you?" Damien slowly shook his head. "No." Walter's expression became thoughtful. "Ethan rarely talks about himself. He believes actions matter more than explanations. Sometimes I wish he understood that silence can also hurt the people who love him." Those words settled deeply inside Damien's heart. Before he could ask another question, Walter reached into the cardboard box and removed a framed photograph. It showed Ethan surrounded by smiling children during last winter's holiday celebration. Noah stood beside him wearing a paper crown while proudly holding Ethan's hand. Every face in the picture radiated genuine happiness. Walter handed the photograph to Damien for a closer look. "He keeps every promise he makes to these children," Walter said quietly. "Even when keeping those promises costs him something personally." Damien stared at the photograph, realizing how completely he had misunderstood the bond he had witnessed. The child had never been evidence of betrayal. It had been evidence of trust. As Damien returned the picture, another volunteer hurried out of the building carrying a sealed envelope. "Walter," she called anxiously, "the hospital just called." Ethan refused to sign the final authorization again. "They said there is almost no time left for him to decide." Walter's gentle smile disappeared, and for the first time Damien saw genuine worry cross the old man's face. Walter thanked the volunteer before carefully taking the sealed envelope into his hands. His expression revealed the weight of news he had hoped would never arrive. Damien stood motionless beside him, unable to ignore what he had just heard. A hospital. A final authorization. Almost no time left. None of it sounded connected to the story he had imagined over the past several weeks. Walter looked toward Damien for a long moment before quietly asking, "Did Ethan ever tell you why he first came to Maple House?" Damien slowly shook his head. Walter sighed softly. "I expected that answer. Ethan believes protecting someone means carrying every burden alone." He opened the envelope just enough to confirm its contents before closing it again. Years ago, after Noah lost his parents, he stopped speaking for months. Doctors and counselors tried everything they could think of. Then one rainy afternoon Ethan happened to volunteer here. He sat beside Noah without asking him a single question. They spent nearly 2 hours folding paper cranes together in complete silence. Before Ethan left, Noah whispered his first words in months. He asked whether Ethan would come back the following Friday. Ethan promised that he would. Walter smiled sadly. He has kept that promise every week ever since. Damien listened without saying a word. Every memory from the past month returned in a completely different light. The pastries. The handmade cards. The laughter. The careful smile Ethan wore every Friday before leaving home. None of it had ever been about hiding another life. It had been about protecting one that desperately needed hope. Walter continued quietly, "The hospital has been helping Noah through a long medical treatment. Ethan has attended almost every appointment because Noah feels safe when he is there. The paperwork you saw was never about Ethan. It has always been about making sure Noah receives everything he needs." Damien lowered his eyes, remembering the folder, the signatures, and the tears Ethan had tried so hard to hide. Shame settled heavily inside him. He had spent weeks searching for evidence of betrayal while Ethan had been spending every spare moment comforting a frightened child. Before Damien could respond, Walter added one sentence that stopped him completely. "The difficult part is not Noah's treatment anymore. The difficult part is Ethan." Damien looked up immediately. Walter hesitated, choosing his words with great care. Several months ago Ethan received unexpected news during a routine medical appointment. He asked every doctor involved to keep the details private until he understood what the future might look like. He believed telling you too early would only bring unnecessary fear. Damien felt his heartbeat quicken. "What kind of news?" Walter slowly shook his head. "That is not my story to tell. Ethan trusted me to respect his privacy, just as he trusted everyone at Maple House. I will honor that trust." Damien wanted to ask a dozen more questions, but Walter gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "If you truly want answers, do not search through records or follow him in secret anymore. Sit beside him the way he once sat beside Noah. Sometimes love begins with listening instead of solving." Those words lingered long after Walter returned inside the building. Damien remained alone on the quiet sidewalk, staring at the colorful flower boxes beneath the windows. For the first time since his suspicions had begun, he understood that every conclusion he had reached had been built upon incomplete pieces of the truth. He drove home earlier than usual and found the penthouse empty. A handwritten note rested on the kitchen counter beneath Ethan's favorite coffee mug. It simply read, "I had to stop by the hospital after Maple House. I will be home later. Please do not wait for dinner." Damien folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He was already reaching for his car keys, determined to meet Ethan face to face instead of hiding in the shadows, when his phone vibrated with an incoming message from an unfamiliar number. There was no greeting, no signature, only a single sentence that made the color drain from his face. "If you truly love Ethan Carter, get to St. Gabriel Medical Center before he signs the papers." Damien did not waste another second. He drove through the evening traffic with only one thought repeating in his mind. Whatever Ethan had been carrying alone was ending tonight. By the time he reached St. Gabriel Medical Center, the lobby had grown quiet beneath soft lights and the distant sound of conversations echoing through the hallways. He stopped at the reception desk and quietly asked for Ethan Carter. The receptionist recognized the name immediately before pointing toward a family consultation room at the end of the corridor. Damien slowed his pace as he approached the partially open door. Inside, Ethan sat across from the same doctor Damien had seen days earlier. The familiar blue folder rested on the table beside several documents awaiting signatures. Ethan listened carefully while the doctor spoke with remarkable kindness. "You still have time to reconsider," the doctor said gently. "Nobody would think less of you if you chose differently." Ethan lowered his eyes and smiled with quiet gratitude. "I have already made my decision. I only wanted to be certain Noah would always have the support he needs before I signed anything." Damien remained outside the doorway, unable to interrupt. The doctor nodded before opening another folder. "The trust fund has been approved. Your anonymous donations will continue covering his education, counseling, and medical care exactly as you requested. Everything is legally protected." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, and a visible weight seemed to leave his shoulders. "Then that is enough." The doctor hesitated before speaking again. "What about Damien? Does he know you have transferred nearly everything you personally owned into this foundation?" Ethan quietly shook his head. "No. He worked too hard to build the life we share. I never wanted him to feel responsible for the promises I made long before we met. He has already given me more happiness than I ever expected. I could never ask him to carry this burden too." Damien felt every painful assumption he had made over the past several weeks crumble completely. There had never been another family hidden from him. There had never been betrayal. There had only been an Omega who quietly devoted his time, his savings, and his heart to protecting children who had already lost too much, while trying just as fiercely to protect the man he loved from unnecessary worry. The doctor slowly pushed the documents closer. "These papers also confirm your treatment schedule. Delaying any longer may reduce your options." Ethan rested one trembling hand on the folder before answering with complete calm. "I know. I was simply waiting until Noah smiled again before beginning everything." Damien could remain silent no longer. He gently pushed the door open. Ethan looked up in complete surprise, his expression shifting from shock to quiet concern. "Damien?" For several seconds neither of them spoke. Damien crossed the room and stopped beside the table, his eyes fixed on the blue folder that had haunted his thoughts for weeks. Then he looked back at Ethan. "I kept searching for proof that you were leaving me," he said softly. "Instead, I discovered how many people are still standing because you never stopped showing up for them." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted you to find out this way." Damien carefully took Ethan's hand into his own. "You never had to protect me from loving you." Silence settled gently around them before Ethan finally whispered, "I was afraid that once you knew everything, you would only see someone carrying too many responsibilities." Damien smiled through the emotion gathering in his eyes. "No. I see the kindest person I have ever known, and I regret every moment I spent doubting you instead of trusting you." Ethan leaned forward, resting his forehead lightly against Damien's shoulder as months of quiet fear finally gave way to relief. The doctor quietly stepped outside, leaving them alone with the truth that had nearly torn them apart. On the table, however, one unopened envelope still remained beneath the treatment schedule. Damien noticed that it bore Ethan's name along with the words "Final Diagnostic Review." Before either of them reached for it, Ethan's phone suddenly vibrated. He answered, listened silently for several seconds, and the peaceful expression on his face slowly disappeared. Looking directly into Damien's eyes, he whispered only one sentence. "Noah is gone. They cannot find him anywhere,